The mahogany boardroom smelled like polished ambition, lemon-scented cleaning agents, and betrayal. I sat at the head of the table, my sharp heels balanced perfectly on the polished floor, my hands wrapped around the cold glass of iced tea Ronan had just handed me. I was Juliana, the corporate litigator who had spent years building a reputation on precision, ferocity, and an unyielding sense of justice. I had just secured a landmark settlement for my husband, Ronan, a victory that should have felt like triumph. But victory never tasted sweet when it was poisoned by those closest to you. Ronan stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows, the light catching the sharp angles of his face. In that moment, I didn't recognize the man I had married. The husband who had promised partnership, trust, and equality now wore the mask of a predator dressed as a partner. His expression was carefully composed, but the chill in his eyes betrayed the truth. He had never been my ally. The partnership agreement reverts the controlling interest to me, Juliana, he said. His voice was eerily calm, stripped of any legal cadence I had come to expect from him. Chloe will take over your executive duties. She doesn't complicate things with ethics. Your insistence on following the letter of the law was becoming a danger to my expansion plans. I remember the way the words landed in my chest, like a blow that left no visible mark but shattered everything inside me. I had spent countless late nights poring over contracts, clauses, and legal loopholes, believing we were building something together, something that respected law, fairness, and principle. And now I realized the foundation had been a lie, constructed on ambition and manipulation, polished with a veneer of charm and feigned affection. Chloe, his cousin, the ever-smiling assistant who always lingered just out of sight, would take over. She thrived in the spaces where ethics faltered, a shadow companion to his ambition, smiling while the world burned in quiet corners. I could almost see her now, poised and calculating, watching me, basking in the promise of my displacement. I sat still, feeling the cold air of betrayal creep through the room, seeping into my bones. My iced tea sweated against my hand, condensation blurring my vision. The triumph I had imagined dissolved into nothingness. I realized in that instant that the woman I had been, the wife who trusted, the partner who believed in fairness, had died. Not with a scream, not with a fight, but quietly, irrevocably, at the hands of the very man I had defended in court, the man I had loved, the man who had been my world. And yet, even as despair threatened to overwhelm me, a spark ignited. Cold, sharp, and precise, the part of me honed over years of litigation, trained to see every angle, every flaw, every hidden clause, rose from the ashes of my broken trust. This part of me didn't weep. It didn't plead. It calculated. It plotted. It knew exactly how to fight the injustice, how to ensure that every reckless expansion, every secretive maneuver Ronan and Chloe attempted, would be halted. I would become the law incarnate. I would ensure that no contract signed in greed could flourish unchecked. Every misstep, every corner cut, every deceptive move would be exposed under the unforgiving light of legal scrutiny. As I watched Ronan smile, believing his dominance absolute, I felt the clarity of purpose settle over me like armor. My mind raced with scenarios, clauses, and vulnerabilities. Every victory he imagined for himself would be systematically dismantled. Every attempt to silence me would rebound. He didn't realize that the woman he had betrayed had already begun constructing her response. I wasn't just going to survive this betrayal. I would thrive. I would rise. I would ensure that Ronan's empire, built on cunning and deception, would encounter the rigid, unyielding force of law. And when it did, I would be waiting, not as the broken wife, but as the strategist, the litigator, and the woman who had been reborn in the fires of betrayal. The boardroom, once a place of celebration, now felt like a courtroom where I was both plaintiff and judge, both witness and executioner. I took a slow sip of iced tea and let the cold clarity fill me. The woman who trusted too easily was gone. The woman who would ensure justice, my justice, was only beginning to emerge. And I would let Ronan and Chloe know exactly what it meant to underestimate me. The fluorescent glare of the law school library was a far cry from the polished mahogany of the boardroom, yet it held a quiet familiarity that grounded me. I sat hunched over a stack of casebooks, my notes splayed like battle plans across the table. The scent of old paper, ink, and the faint tang of cafeteria coffee filled the air. I blinked, disoriented for a moment, before the reality hit. This was no hallucination. I had woken up years before the betrayal, years before Ronan and Chloe could manipulate the contracts that had cost me everything. The date blinked on the corner of my laptop. January 10th, 2016. 21 years old. Idealistic. Hungry. I had the chance to prevent the very sequence of events that had shattered my life and every fiber of my being tightened with purpose. I wasn't thinking about revenge yet, not in the petty sense. I was thinking about prevention, about foresight, about using the knowledge I now possessed to build a legal fortress strong enough to withstand any greed-driven attack. And there was only one person I could trust to help me navigate this intricate early battle: Samuel. Samuel, the partner I had once admired from afar, the man Ronan had dismissed as too focused on pro bono work and too tedious to be useful in expansion projects. Samuel had a reputation for precision, a quiet moral compass that guided every case he touched. He wasn't flashy, and he didn't seek power, but in him, I recognized the integrity I would need to counteract the corruption that Ronan and Chloe were quietly plotting. I found him that evening in the archives, the room dim and musty, filled with dusty files, old case logs, and the faint hum of fluorescent lights overhead. He was bent over a stack of contracts, his meticulous handwriting annotating each clause with care and foresight. There was an intensity in his focus that drew me in, a sense that he treated the law not just as a profession, but as a moral responsibility. I approached him, my steps careful. I didn't need to explain everything yet. I simply offered the precise information I had about the looming catastrophe, a hidden flaw in a land acquisition deal that Ronan intended to finalize. Chloe, poised and manipulative, would help him cover it up, ensuring that no early warning could disrupt their scheme. I leaned close enough for him to hear, whispering the clause that would later unravel everything. If this acquisition proceeds unchecked, I said, it will result in catastrophic lawsuits. I know the precise vulnerability. I need your integrity to prevent this from ever happening. Samuel straightened slowly, his eyes locking onto mine. There was no judgment, no skepticism, only the quiet weight of someone who understood the gravity of what I was asking. I didn't need to convince him with charm or theatrics. He recognized the ethical imperative in my voice and in the details I had supplied. Over the next few weeks, I began mapping the moves Ronan would make, cataloging every decision he would take for profit at the expense of legal propriety. I combined that knowledge with Samuel's keen insight and moral authority, laying the groundwork for interventions that would block the critical deals before they even became binding. Every clause, every loophole, every contract amendment became a tool we would wield to prevent disaster. I also began to notice something else, something that had nothing to do with legal strategy. Samuel's presence was steady, calming, and unshakably loyal. In a world that had nearly consumed me with ambition, greed, and betrayal, there was comfort in his quiet efficiency. I felt a strange sense of safety, a reassurance that no matter what manipulations awaited me, he would hold the line. As the weeks passed, I realized that my foresight wasn't just a weapon against Ronan and Chloe, it was a bridge to an unexpected partnership, a collaboration rooted in mutual respect and shared ethical conviction. For the first time, I sensed that this wasn't merely about preventing disaster. It was about aligning myself with someone whose principles were as uncompromising as my own, someone I could trust with more than just strategy. And though I kept my focus on the work, there were moments, fleeting touches of the hand as we pored over documents, the subtle brush of shoulders when navigating crowded stacks of files, where I felt a connection growing between us, quiet, patient, undeniable. Samuel was no longer just a strategic ally. He was becoming my anchor in a turbulent, treacherous world. The battle against Ronan and Chloe was only beginning, but for the first time since waking in this second chance, I felt the faint thrill of hope. Not just for justice, but for the life I could rebuild, and for the man whose unwavering presence promised that I would not have to do it alone. The quiet hum of the archive had become a sanctuary, a place where time slowed and every detail mattered. I spent hours poring over contracts, cross-referencing clauses, and highlighting vulnerabilities only I knew would be exploited in the future. Each document felt like a chess piece, waiting for the right hand to place it, to disrupt a carefully orchestrated plan of greed and manipulation. Ronan and Chloe operated like a well-oiled machine, his ambition paired with her cunning, a combination I had once underestimated. But now, armed with hindsight, I saw the cracks in their collaboration, the points where morality would inevitably collide with deception. Every deal they attempted to push, every contract they drafted without conscience, became a blueprint for the intervention Samuel and I were quietly engineering. The first step was subtle. I didn't want confrontation. I wanted prevention. I began by reviewing the land acquisition clauses in exhaustive detail, tracing the regulatory gaps that would allow Ronan to circumvent environmental compliance. Chloe had already marked the weak points, but she did so with a veneer of legitimacy. She knew I could spot the lie, even before it existed. I annotated the sections Samuel needed to challenge, crafting a strategy so precise it felt surgical. It was in these hours of meticulous planning that I noticed Samuel's methods. He worked with the patience of someone who understood that law was not just about winning, it was about integrity. Every annotation, every footnote, every calculated suggestion was rooted in principle, not performance. I found myself studying him more than the documents at times, noticing the subtle rhythm of his movements, the quiet confidence that radiated from his posture, the way he absorbed information like a still pond, reflecting clarity instead of chaos. There were moments when our hands brushed over pages, fleeting contacts that sent a subtle current of awareness through me. I reminded myself repeatedly to focus, to channel my energy into the mission, but the sensation lingered, a reminder that there was something more than strategy growing between us. By the end of the first week, we had identified the earliest and most critical deal Ronan intended to finalize, one that would have triggered a cascade of subsequent manipulations. The clause was buried in a supplemental contract, a detail no casual observer would notice. Samuel and I devised a preemptive motion, a legal safeguard that would prevent execution until a thorough compliance review was complete. It was the first step in a slow, deliberate process to undermine the entire trajectory of Ronan and Chloe's plans without alerting them. The satisfaction was intoxicating. Watching Samuel review my notes, his brow furrowed in concentration, I realized how rare it was to find someone who shared the same moral compass, someone who saw the law not as a weapon but as a shield. And though I tried to remain strictly professional, I couldn't deny the pull of admiration, the growing sense of trust that deepened with every strategic decision we made together. I also began to recognize my own transformation. Gone was the naive litigator who had once believed love and partnership could coexist with ambition unchecked. The woman I had become was patient, precise, and unyielding, capable of seeing the future and acting decisively to protect not just herself, but the principles she held dear. And in Samuel, I saw the mirror of that resilience, the reflection of integrity I had longed for in Ronan and never found. By the end of the second week, our preemptive motion was ready for submission. I watched Samuel file it with quiet authority, the weight of its potential hanging between us. The gesture was small, professional, almost mundane, but it carried the promise of a future where Ronan's manipulations could be stopped and where the law, not greed, would prevail. And then came a fleeting moment, impossible to ignore. Samuel's hand lingered just slightly over mine as he returned the file to me, his fingers brushing against mine in a contact that was more intimate than it seemed. It was silent, understated, yet charged with unspoken acknowledgement. A subtle warmth, a shared understanding, a spark of connection between two people bound by principle, strategy, and slowly, something deeper. I reminded myself, the battle was far from over. Ronan and Chloe would not yield easily. But as I left the archives that evening, I felt something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years: hope. Not just hope for justice, but hope for the possibility of a partnership built on truth, loyalty, and shared purpose. And somewhere beneath that, a tentative awareness that the heart, too, could find its place amid strategy and principle. The law was patient, methodical, and I had learned to move with it rather than against it. After the filing of our preemptive motion, the world outside the library seemed to hum with a quiet tension. I walked through the bustling city streets, briefcase in hand, and watched as life moved unaware around me. People talked about lunch, deadlines, coffee, the mundane routines of ordinary ambition. They had no idea the storm I had set in motion, guided by foresight and Samuel's unshakable ethical compass. Ronan's empire, so carefully constructed on greed and manipulation, was beginning to show subtle cracks. The first ripple was almost imperceptible: a delayed contract approval, a cautious email from an investor, a minor legal hold that caused Ronan to pause. But, to me, it was everything. Each hesitation was a thread unraveling the tightly wound tapestry he had woven. I imagined Chloe pacing, frustrated that her schemes were thwarted before they even had a chance to bloom. And I felt no guilt, only anticipation, precision, and the calm satisfaction of inevitability. Back in the firm, Samuel and I reviewed every document, every clause, and every potential loophole that Ronan and Chloe could exploit next. I observed him as he worked, his quiet intensity a constant anchor. There was no need for words most of the time. Our understanding had become intuitive. A glance at a line of text, a subtle gesture toward a margin note, and we were aligned. Two minds united not just by strategy, but by a shared moral foundation. It was during one of these long sessions that I began to notice the subtle ways our connection deepened. Samuel's hand would brush mine when passing a file. His arm would briefly touch my shoulder as he leaned to examine a contract. I told myself it was incidental, professional, but there was a warmth in the contact, a grounding presence that I hadn't known I craved. I realized, almost with a jolt, that I was no longer focused solely on the battles against Ronan and Chloe. My awareness of Samuel was growing, threading its way into my thoughts like an unanticipated subplot in a case I thought I understood completely. The work itself was intoxicating. Watching Ronan hesitate, seeing Chloe's frantic attempts to spin legal loopholes into advantage, feeling the weight of justice tip toward the ethical, it was exhilarating. I was rewriting history with the law as my instrument, crafting an outcome where greed could not dictate terms. And Samuel was the counterbalance to my foresight, calm, steady, unshakable. I trusted him implicitly, more than I trusted anyone else in the world, and I felt it reflected in the way he deferred to my knowledge, even as he applied his authority with quiet strength. Late one evening, after a particularly grueling review of environmental impact clauses, Samuel and I leaned over the same pile of files. Our shoulders brushed, and this time, the contact lingered. I didn't pull away. I allowed the moment to settle, a shared recognition of endurance, intelligence, and increasingly, desire. The work had created proximity, and the proximity had begun to awaken something neither of us could deny. There was no need for words. The air between us carried a quiet promise, a gentle acknowledgement that this alliance was deepening into something profoundly personal. Despite the closeness, the focus never wavered. Each motion we filed, each clause we corrected, each potential violation we exposed was a calculated strike against the empire that had once left me powerless. I realized that while the legal battles were my primary concern, the presence of Samuel, steady, principled, protective, was becoming a fortress for my heart, just as our motions were a fortress for justice. By the end of the week, the first tangible impact was evident. Ronan had begun to second-guess a deal, Chloe's confidence wavered, and I felt the quiet satisfaction of a tide beginning to turn. And through it all, Samuel remained beside me, hands brushing, shoulders touching, presence unwavering. The combination of strategy and subtle intimacy was intoxicating, grounding me in a way I hadn't realized I needed. For the first time since waking in this second chance, I felt balance, control over my professional future, and an awareness that my personal heart was no longer untouchable. The law had given me purpose, and Samuel had become my anchor, quietly proving that loyalty, ethics, and trust could exist together, even amid treachery. The morning light filtered through the tall windows of the law library, illuminating the stacks of contracts and case files that had become my battlefield. I moved with deliberate precision, organizing the dossiers that would serve as the foundation of our preemptive strikes against Ronan and Chloe. Each document was a thread, each clause a potential lever, and I was determined to pull at the right spots with calculated care. Ronan had no idea that the very tools he had once wielded to manipulate others were now being turned against him. I imagined him pacing in his sleek office, frustrated that deals I had once facilitated were now stalling. Chloe, with her insidious cunning and subtle influence, was working tirelessly to patch the cracks. But I had foresight, and I had Samuel. Together, we were methodical, deliberate, and unrelenting. Samuel arrived before the firm opened, as he often did, carrying a quiet intensity that set the tone for the day. I watched him review filings and regulations, his movements precise, almost meditative. There was a rhythm to his work, a careful balance of discipline and intuition. I had always admired skill, but with Samuel, admiration quickly deepened into something more visceral. His quiet confidence, his unwavering integrity, created a gravitational pull I could not ignore. As we reviewed the contracts that had caused Ronan to overlook critical environmental clauses, our hands occasionally brushed over pages. Each touch was fleeting, almost imperceptible, yet charged with unspoken acknowledgement. I reminded myself that our focus must remain on the work, the exposures, the filings, the legal dominoes we intended to topple. Still, my pulse betrayed me with every accidental contact, a silent drumbeat echoing the tension building between us. We implemented our first strategic strike by filing an injunction that challenged a high-stakes land acquisition. The clauses were hidden, intentionally obscure, and without our intervention, they would have slipped through unnoticed, granting Ronan unchecked power and leaving Chloe's manipulations intact. I had memorized every detail, the environmental oversight, the corporate loopholes, the sequence of signatures. I fed this knowledge to Samuel, who translated it into precise legal action, a meticulous blend of strategy and principle. Throughout the day, our interactions were minimal yet significant. The subtle brush of his hand as he handed me a file, the way he leaned closer to point out a critical footnote, the quiet intensity of his gaze, it all created a current beneath the professional surface. Each moment was a reminder that I was not alone in this fight, that our alliance extended beyond contracts and clauses. There was trust, respect, and an unspoken intimacy that had begun to grow between us. By mid-afternoon, the effects of our actions were already emerging. A corporate board paused negotiations, investors hesitated, and the chain of deals Ronan had so carefully orchestrated faltered. Chloe's irritation was palpable, even from the distant monitoring reports Samuel and I had arranged. There was a thrill in watching the first tangible consequences of our preemptive work, the knowledge that every detail I had remembered from the future was being used to protect not just the law, but integrity itself. The day's final moments were quieter, intimate in their own understated way. We leaned over a sprawling contract, reviewing each line together, our shoulders brushing as we studied the margins. Samuel's hand rested briefly over mine while pointing to a clause, a deliberate contact that sent warmth along my arm. I didn't pull away. Instead, I allowed the sensation to settle, a reminder that even amidst strategy and battles, there was room for connection, for trust, for something quietly tender that I had long denied myself. As the office emptied, leaving only the hum of fluorescent lights and the soft rustle of papers, I felt a strange serenity. The day had been exhausting, yet empowering. Ronan's schemes had been disrupted, Chloe's influence challenged, and I had Samuel beside me, unwavering and steadfast. The intimacy between us, subtle but undeniable, was a new kind of grounding, an unspoken promise of loyalty and shared purpose that extended beyond the legal realm. Walking out into the cool evening air, I realized that our partnership had transformed into something more profound. Not only were we dismantling a corrupt empire, but we were quietly building a connection founded on principle, respect, and a growing, undeniable attraction. And though the battle was far from over, I felt a renewed strength, not just in our legal strategy, but in the knowledge that Samuel's presence would be my anchor through the storm. The late afternoon light slanted through the tall windows of the law library, casting long shadows across stacks of documents and leather-bound case files. I sat at the corner table, my eyes tracing the fine print of a corporate acquisition clause that would, if left unchecked, have allowed Ronan's ambitions to spiral unchecked. Samuel leaned over my shoulder, pointing out a subtle legal discrepancy. Our hands brushed lightly against each other as he reached for a folder. For a moment, I froze, not because the contact was inappropriate, but because it sent a ripple through me I hadn't expected. There was something steady and grounding in the way his fingers lingered ever so briefly, a tactile assurance that I could trust him with more than just these cases. I looked up at him, catching his gaze. His eyes, calm and precise, held no judgment, only a quiet intensity that seemed to pull me closer without a word. We spent hours reviewing contracts, but the air between us had shifted. Each moment of shared focus carried a subtle charge, an awareness that extended beyond legal strategy. Samuel's presence was magnetic, steady, protective, and I found my thoughts straying from clauses and footnotes to the curve of his jaw, the strength in his hands, the way he carried the weight of his own convictions with such quiet confidence. By evening, the library had emptied. The city outside was muted in a golden glow, and the hum of fluorescent lights overhead seemed softer somehow. Samuel leaned back in his chair, stretching slightly, and I noticed the faint warmth radiating from his hand as it briefly touched mine again, while pointing to a paragraph. This time, I let my fingers linger against his. A tiny, deliberate connection, a quiet acknowledgement that the intensity we shared at work was spilling into something more personal. I felt a sudden, compelling urge to lean closer, to feel the solidity of him as more than just a partner in law. When he glanced at me, the corners of his lips curled into the faintest, almost imperceptible smile. No words were needed. He understood what I was thinking, the unspoken acknowledgement that what had started as professional alignment was beginning to root itself deeper. The first kiss came unexpectedly, not dramatic or sudden, but gradual. Our hands brushed over the same contract, fingers intertwining as we leaned closer, drawn by gravity neither of us had named. His touch was firm, grounding, and reassuring. My pulse raced as I felt the warmth of him, the certainty of his presence. When our lips met, it was careful, deliberate, and utterly genuine, a seal of trust, a quiet affirmation that the partnership we had built in law extended into something profoundly personal. Even in that small, hushed library corner, the world felt as if it had shifted. The tension of battling Ronan and Chloe, the meticulous planning, the ethical vigilance, all of it softened in that moment of intimacy. Samuel's arms wrapped around me briefly, protective and steady, and I rested against him, feeling a rare sense of safety. I realized then that this connection, slow, quiet, deliberate, was as essential as the strategies we deployed against corruption. Hours later, walking through the empty streets back to our respective apartments, I couldn't stop thinking about the weight of his hand against mine, the steady confidence in his gaze, and the certainty that, together, we were not just dismantling an empire built on greed, but quietly constructing something genuine, something lasting, something ours. The legal battles were far from over, but for the first time, I felt anchored, not just in justice, but in the unexpected warmth of trust, loyalty, and burgeoning love. The office was quiet, the hum of the city outside barely audible over the soft click of our keyboards. I sat across from Samuel at the long conference table, reviewing a stack of revised contracts and environmental reports. Each line we scrutinized was a potential trap for Ronan and Chloe, and each minute brought us closer to dismantling the empire that had once betrayed me. But beneath the professional intensity, there was a current I could no longer ignore. Every time Samuel leaned over to point out a clause, our shoulders brushed. Every time he handed me a pen or a folder, our fingers met. At first, I dismissed the sparks as fleeting, easily ignored. But the warmth that shot through me with each contact became impossible to overlook. During a long review of a particularly complex acquisition, I felt his hand graze mine again, lingering just a moment longer than necessary. My pulse quickened, and I caught myself imagining that touch as deliberate, a silent communication between us. Samuel's gaze met mine across the table, steady, intense, and undeniably aware. I could feel the subtle curve of his smile, and my lips lifted in response, a quiet acknowledgement of the tension growing between us. Hours passed without a word beyond work, yet every subtle movement carried meaning. When he leaned closer to point out a minor error in a footnote, I felt the heat of his body brush mine. I shifted slightly, deliberately letting my hand brush against his arm as I reached for a document. A small, playful spark passed between us, an unspoken acknowledgement of what neither of us had named aloud. By the late evening, the office was deserted, the warm glow of desk lamps casting long shadows. Samuel and I lingered over the final review of a key contract that would halt Ronan's next acquisition. Our hands touched again over the paperwork, and this time I didn't pull away. Instead, I allowed the contact to linger, letting the intimacy expand slowly, deliberately, without words. He leaned closer, just enough that our arms brushed, our breaths mingling in the quiet space between us. I felt a shiver run down my spine, a mix of anticipation and the rare comfort of trust. His presence was grounding, his energy protective and warm. I wanted to lean into him, to feel the solidity of him against my own vulnerability. Finally, without preamble, our lips met. The kiss was slow, deliberate, exploring, and entirely consensual. His hand came up to cradle my jaw, thumb brushing lightly across my skin, grounding me even as my heart raced. I responded instinctively, pressing closer, feeling the warmth of his chest and the strength of his embrace. It was a kiss of trust, of unspoken promises, a seal on the partnership that had grown into something far more personal. When we finally pulled back, just enough to breathe, his eyes held mine with a steady, unwavering intensity. No words were needed. The subtle, lingering touches, our fingers brushing, the press of his hand against mine, spoke volumes. In the quiet aftermath of the kiss, I realized that our shared purpose, our ethical mission, and the countless hours of strategy had created a bond far deeper than mere attraction. As we packed up our materials, I felt Samuel's hand graze mine again, just lightly, almost teasingly. I returned the touch, letting our fingers intertwine briefly, savoring the small, intimate connection. Outside, the city lights flickered, but inside, I felt anchored, supported, and undeniably, irrevocably drawn to him. Ronan and Chloe's schemes were still out there, waiting to be dismantled, but for the first time, I felt invincible. Not because of legal strategy or professional cunning, but because of the warmth, trust, and growing intimacy between Samuel and me. In the midst of chaos and betrayal, I had found my shield, my anchor, and perhaps even something far more powerful, a quiet, patient, and undeniable love. The courtroom smelled of polished wood and anticipation. I adjusted my blazer, steadying my nerves, though my mind was entirely calm. Samuel's presence at my side was a steadying force, a constant reminder that I was no longer facing battles alone. Together, we had meticulously uncovered every fraudulent clause, every manipulated document, every unethical maneuver Ronan and Chloe had attempted. As I stepped to the podium, I felt Samuel's hand briefly brush mine. The contact was grounding, a silent acknowledgement that we had survived the storm of past betrayal, and now, we were about to finish the fight. His calm gaze met mine, and in it, I saw more than just professional confidence. I saw trust, loyalty, and the promise of a future untainted by the greed and deceit that had once defined my life. The hearing began. Evidence compiled over months of careful investigation was laid bare. Each contract Ronan had manipulated crumbled under scrutiny. Chloe's intricate attempts to mask her influence were exposed with precision. And through it all, Samuel's meticulous attention to detail fortified my every argument, bolstering my confidence and reinforcing the truth we had worked so hard to protect. At one point, our hands brushed again across the shared notes on the podium. I didn't pull away. Instead, I allowed the contact to linger, savoring the warmth and stability his presence offered. My pulse quickened, not from fear, but from the subtle intimacy we had cultivated over months of shared labor and trust. By the time the judge delivered the final verdict, Ronan and Chloe's schemes had been completely unraveled. The contracts were invalidated, their attempts at corporate domination thwarted, and their unethical practices publicly exposed. Justice, in its most meticulous and undeniable form, had been served. And yet, amid the professional triumph, my heart still raced for a more personal victory. Samuel stepped closer as I gathered the scattered papers, his fingers brushing mine with casual familiarity. "We did it," he said softly. His voice carried the weight of relief, pride, and something deeper that resonated in my chest. I smiled, leaning slightly into him, feeling the warmth of his body and the unwavering steadiness he radiated. In the quiet aftermath, the office emptied, leaving only the two of us amid the soft glow of desk lamps and the lingering scent of polished wood. Samuel's hand found mine once more, and this time, I didn't hesitate to entwine our fingers fully. Our closeness was no longer tentative. It was deliberate, a silent celebration of survival, victory, and newfound intimacy. Then, almost imperceptibly, he drew me closer, his arms wrapping around my waist. I rested against him, the familiar solidity of his body grounding me. Our lips met in a slow, deliberate kiss, gentle yet suffused with the depth of all we had endured. It was a kiss that spoke of trust, safety, and the quiet certainty of love built on shared battles and unwavering loyalty. As we pulled back, our foreheads pressed together, I realized that everything I had feared losing, control, reputation, security, even my own heart, was safe in his hands. Samuel's gaze held mine, steady and unwavering, a mirror of the protection and affection he had offered from the very beginning. Years later, we ran the most respected ethical law practice in the city, renowned for integrity, transparency, and unwavering justice. Ronan and Chloe were a cautionary tale, reminders of the shadows we had risen above. And in the calm after the storm, I finally understood that true victory wasn't just about dismantling corruption. It was about finding someone whose presence anchored you completely. Samuel's hand in mine was no longer just comfort, it was home. And in that home, surrounded by truth, justice, and quiet love, I finally felt unshakably whole.